All right. I've been instructed that we are now on the hour and it's time to begin. So welcome everybody to this Bruegel event, Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology, where we are very fortunate to have a distinguished professor, Anu Bradford, here visiting us from Columbia, where she is a professor of law and well known for her first book, The Brussels Effect. Now we have the second one, or at least maybe there are more, but those are the two that I know about and make a little series, really. So it's terrific to be able to host her and hear about this new work, which is really highly topical today with the big problems that we have with digital platforms in many jurisdictions. So the way we're going to run this session is Anu is going to introduce the book for about 15 minutes or so. I have a few questions, and then after that discussion, we'll open it up to you here in this room. For the people online, there is a Slido way to ask a question, and the hashtag is digital regulations, all one word with an S at the end. And so you can submit those anytime, and I have a little tablet here that will record them, and we'll call on those remote people when we get to that stage. Okay, so welcome, Anu. Thank you so much for coming. We are looking forward to hearing about the book.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everybody at Bruegel for hosting me and for joining the conversation. So in many ways, the digital empires builds on the work of the Brussels effect. I'm still interested in Europe's place in the world, and now with this book in particular, what is Europe's place in the digital world? So the book starts from this premise that there is increasingly a consensus around the world that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. And I think it's helpful for us to think about it, that there are three primary models to think about digital governance. So there is an American, what I call a market-driven model. There's a Chinese state-driven model. And then there's a European, what I have labeled rights-driven model. So these all reflect different values and sort of instincts about the right relationship between the markets and the state and individuals. So the American market model is premised on this idea that we want to maximize free internet, free speech, and incentives to innovate. So the government only is reserved a minimalist role, and the governance of technology is primarily handed to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-libertarian, very techno-optimist view of the world. The Chinese have some shared goals with the Americans. They are very focused on innovation. They want to make China a technological superpower. But at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is leveraging technology towards its political goals. So technology is a tool to perform tasks around censorship and surveillance and propaganda in order to entrench the political control of the Communist Party and ensure social stability in the country. So the Europeans are in this public conversation often portrayed as being forced to choose between the US and China. The EU doesn't have a similarly thriving tech industry and is often then seen to be more at the mercy of this unfolding tech war between the two real players. And I argue that the Europeans are not forced to, nor are they prepared to, choose between the US and China. So the American model for the Europeans is uncomfortable as the Chinese model, just for different reasons. So while the Europeans find the Chinese model too oppressive, it's digital authoritarianism basically, the American model for the Europeans is too permissive. So the Europeans have really then carved out their own digital governance model. And it is centered on this human-centric digital transformation, where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals and the preservation of democratic structures of the society and a notion of a more fair distribution of the gains from the digital economy takes the center stage. So these are the three primary models that I think we are witnessing in the global regulatory debate. But why I then use the more provocative title, perhaps empires, and title these jurisdictions empires, I use the term metaphorically, but I think it is still descriptive of what we are observing, because none of these regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each power is exporting their respective regulatory model, but they do it through different tools. So the US is primarily exporting the private power of its tech companies. The US tech companies are everywhere. We're all using their products and services. If you just think about Meta's Facebook, it has 3 billion users in 160 countries. And these companies are expanding then the American sphere of influence and the kind of market-driven thinking that is part of the ethos of these companies. China is, in my view, primarily expanding its sphere of influence through infrastructure. So it is building 5G networks, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, these surveillance technologies that are being exported along the digital Silk Road. That reaches across Asia and Africa and Latin America and even parts of Europe. So what is then the way that the Europeans are expanding their sphere of influence? And that is the European superpower, which is regulation. So the Europeans are often taking the lead in regulating the digital economy. And here, through this phenomenon that I described in my earlier book, The Brussels Effect, the European digital regulations often get entrenched not just in Europe, but across the global marketplace, when these tech companies often adjust their global conduct and their global production to European rules. So this is now already then an argument in the book that we don't necessarily see a digital economy balkanizing in these distinct spheres of influence, but often these spheres of influence are overlapping in third markets because each empire is contributing a different layer to digital governance. So we have many markets where you observe American tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and also see the presence of European regulations. So these empires also then come into conflict. And I focus on sort of two types of thinking about these regulatory battles that we are observing. So we witness this horizontal battle, and that's the battle between the empires. So the US-China tech war is a major horizontal battle. But also the many regulatory battles between the US and the EU, where the EU thinks that the US tech companies are overreaching. They are taking more than they are giving in our market, whether it's a data privacy violations, whether it's abuse of their dominant position, or whether it is then refusal to pay digital taxes. Whereas when the Europeans are then confronting that overreach with their regulation, American concern is often that it's the European regulators that are overreaching. But in addition to these horizontal battles, we are witnessing these vertical battles because each empire is also looking to regulate the tech companies in their own markets. And these two battles are interlinked. So for instance, the US is hesitant to really pursue an aggressive vertical battle because it cannot fully rein in its tech companies because it needs those companies to prevail in the horizontal battle against China. So there is the kind of balancing act that we also witness in these elements of restraint. So let me now move into the question that probably interests most of you in this room, which is what happens in these battles? Who prevails? Who wins the horizontal battle and who wins the vertical battle? So here I'm prepared to make a couple of predictions. First of which is that I believe that the American digital empire is declining. There are fewer and fewer takers of the market-driven regulatory model anymore. Because I think there's a sense, not just in Europe, but in many parts of the world, that tech companies cannot be trusted. They need to be regulated. They have become too powerful. And their power is so multifaceted. They have economic power, political power, informational, cultural power, and too much of that power over our societies and over our individual lives. So there is a backlash against this excessive power of the tech companies, even today in the United States. So even Americans are now sort of second guessing whether this techno-libertarian worldview has really served the country well. It certainly hasn't led to more robust democracy or inclusive conversations online. And also the failings in terms of data privacy have become obvious, as has the market power of these companies and the negative effect that it has. So if the American model is losing at least the ideological battle, that means that the European model is actually gaining more influence. So more and more people think that the Europeans had it right to inject more of a state and more regulation in organizing the marketplace. So that can be very comforting for many in Brussels, but there are also a few concerns about that. So especially in the US is thinking about moving towards greater regulation, but there is this notion that if we regulate like the Europeans, what happens to our innovation? What happens to the tech sector? So there is this very persistent view that more digital regulation is always sort of equated with less innovation. And I dispute that notion in the book. That is not my main concern with European model. I'm deeply worried about the state of European innovation, but I am not blaming the GDPR for that. I think there's a host of other issues, including the absence of an integrated digital single market, not having the deep integrated capital markets union, having bankruptcy laws that really make failure too costly for our entrepreneurs, and not having access to the world's best capital, the world's best human capital, talent, the way America does have. So there are many issues in the European tech ecosystem that needs a reform, but I don't think that scraping digital regulation is what would get the Europe to a better place in global tech competition. I'm more worried about the Europeans underdoing than overdoing regulation. I'm really worried about the lack of implementation, the enforcement that is lagging behind that vision, and that often then risks making this European the model, the ideological battle, the victory in that hollow, if you actually still have the American model prevail in practice because Europeans cannot fully enforce their regulations. The one challenge for Europeans too is that while the European model is doing really well in the democratic world, it doesn't have many takers in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning countries. And the number of those countries is growing. They don't share the same set of values. They don't think about in the mornings, how do I maximize individuals' right to privacy? They don't draft their digital regulations towards preserving democracy. They are much more drawn to the Chinese model. So the Chinese model is also doing extremely well, and digital authoritarian values are gaining great traction. So this ultimately leaves me with the biggest concern that I had after writing the book, and it really left me concerned about the future of liberal democracy. That's the battle to me that matters the most. And I think it's important that we realize that that battle can be lost in one of two ways. It will be lost if the US and the EU lose their horizontal battle to China. That means a world that has less and less freedom and more control. But liberal democracy is also being undermined if the US and the EU lose their vertical battle to tech companies. The US is thinking of regulation, but it has a really hard time actually legislating. China doesn't have a hard time legislating. The Europeans can legislate, but Europeans have a really hard time enforcing. Whereas when the Chinese Communist Party decides that it's time to crack down on big tech, they do crack down on big tech. And they are not drawn into year-long court battles and trying to defend their regulatory choices. So I think what is a real challenge then for Europeans and Americans is to show that there is a liberal democratic way to govern technology, that our model actually works. And it's not that only authoritarians are able to regulate the digital economy, whereas the democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor. So ultimately, if that happens, if we cannot successfully implement our regulations, and Americans cannot help us to do that in the end, I think we are forced to conclude, and this would be a really hard conclusion, that the true digital empires are either the authoritarians or the tech companies themselves. And I don't think anybody who believes in liberal democracy as a foundation of our digital society and human engagement is willing to live with that conclusion. So let me maybe end it there, Fiona.
Well, how cheerful this book is. All right, so I have very many questions, but I'm going to confine myself to just a few top ones. I wanted to, being an American, I wanted to probe the idea that this US view that we should not really regulate and private enterprise is good and innovation is good and so on, is really caused by the big platforms. So if you combine the monopoly profit and the desire to keep monopoly profit with the laws we have in the United States on campaign finance, which is any corporation can give pretty much anything they want to any candidate and have it be secret. Then what you get from that is platforms controlling the conversation and the laws, right? They buy the congresspersons and get the laws that they want. And when they're controlling the conversation, that conversation goes along the lines of any regulation you might have toward digital platforms will destroy innovation, your Amazon package won't arrive, your search will stop working, and everything bad will happen. And I think that that's very much a framing that is a self-interested framing. We regulate automobiles, and they didn't like it when seatbelts were required. And then it turned out that if you tell car companies it's time to innovate, but you have to have these safety standards, then we get crumple front ends, and we get airbags, and we get better seatbelts, and we get cars that are lovely. So the concept of regulation isn't really as scary, I think, as the platforms want. But anyway, this is a comment that does end in a question. And I would say then that once you have the platforms controlling the framing and the debate and the politics, then the platforms want to elect Republicans because Republicans just want to have the speech that they want to have on platforms, and they're in no way against profit, right? Profit is, inequality is good from that perspective. And so there isn't really then any notion that the regulation would improve anything from that perspective. So that means that what the EU did that was clever is regulate in that moment before the election, the ability to have real elections was lost, and while there was still the democratic process working. So if you think about it from that perspective, does that change your view on where the U.S. is going? I mean, because I feel like you can survey people, and the people can say, yes, this is terrible. But that doesn't mean anything is going to change by the way we regulate things if the model of the platforms are actually the ones choosing the laws is the right model.
I think it is a really helpful and unfortunately accurate framing. And I think it leaves us even more concerned of whether reform is possible in the US if you have basically dismantled the very democratic institutions that would have the authority to rewrite those laws. Because ultimately, I've argued that the tech companies can be regulated. They cannot decouple themselves from the governments. They cannot force their way into mergers. They cannot refuse to pay taxes that are due. It's just a matter of whether our governments have the political will to deploy the authority that is vested with them. So you may have heard of this Section 230, that's the liability shield in the US that basically gives these platforms the freedom to take down content if they want or not to take down that content. Regardless, they are not liable. That really set these companies free to do as they please. But the US lawmakers, they retain the authority to rewrite that law, and they can repeal that law, but yet they cannot muster the political will to do so. And I think that is exactly the right diagnosis. Today it's hard. They are regulating in the shadow of US-China tech war. And that is the kind of conversation that resonates, is that we cannot crack down on the companies that are the source of our innovation. These companies that are now our sort of internet era monopolies are also likely to be the monopolies when it comes to AI. And it seems to be the strategic asset of the country. But there is exactly the problem that political reform is hampered because of the power that these platforms hold over conversations about the elections, but also direct campaign contributions to the very elected officials that are supposed to make the change. So that, I think, is one concern. There's another path, Fiona, and I'd be curious whether you think that is a then better path for reform, that we have our executive branch. For instance, President Biden is now very committed to trying to turn the ship in antitrust. And we see ambitious cases brought by the FTC and the DOJ, so the competition enforcement agencies in the US, and trying to get the change through the courts. And that is something, if you are now following, for instance, the litigation targeting Google, whether that would then bring about a change in the United States. But we don't yet know if the US courts are still kind of enthralled with this market-driven ideology, or whether they are prepared to overturn their traditional way to think about regulation.
So I hate to be depressing also, but I'm going to tell you that the antitrust cases in the United States are not the solution. They are not the solution for two reasons, well, maybe three reasons. One, it's not clear that courts do perceive that a monopolization case is a real thing anymore and that a plaintiff could win one. So they are quite conservative. Secondly, the cases that have been brought are a very narrow slice of the problem, very narrow. So should there be more entry in search? Should Facebook be allowed to buy up all the nascent social media companies that it feels might compete with it in the future? Should we have a monopoly ad tech stack in the United States? And what's the fourth one? Should Amazon be allowed to have MFNs? Okay, those are excellent questions. I actually think all of those cases are strong on the merits in terms of the economic arguments that underlie them. Again, that doesn't mean you win. But we have so many problems outside those particular narrow issues that I don't think we can rely on antitrust to do it. Third, even if they were to win in those four narrow areas, it's not clear what the remedies are. So you tell Amazon, well, like, the Amazon MFN one takes too long to do in this format, so I'll skip that. But let's just think about Google search. The obvious thing that the judge is likely to do is say, well, all these contracts that you're telling me about that were exclusionary, I'm going to ban them. Well, guess what? The Europeans did that in 2016. Is everything all right? Oh, okay, good. And what happened to Google's market share? It went from 94% to 90%. Plus a choice screen, of course, all the contracts and the choice screen. So we already know that these remedies do not cause contestability in search, and what the United States is likely to do is just mimic them. And so I think the combination of all of those answers tells you that antitrust is nowhere near enough. We need a regulator, and we need a much broader approach, thinking about privacy, thinking about algorithms, thinking about fairness, thinking about contestability, thinking about safety, all of that put together. I wanted to push back on one thing about the contest with China. I never understand what that actually means. How does Facebook win against China? I mean, it sounds to me like the argument is let us be monopolies in the United States, make lots and lots of profit and money off of exploiting US consumers, and then somehow we're going to take that money and do battle with China. And I don't understand how that, as an American citizen, which I am, newsflash, gets me anywhere. How am I made better off by that? I would rather have my tech companies competing hard and giving me consumer surplus and lots of good quality and innovation. And then I don't really care about if there's some battle in China over who wins there. That's the Chinese government's problem. I don't get any utility or care about that. I would like my government to protect me from viruses, hackers, invasions of my privacy, and so forth. That all makes sense. But why do I need to enrich Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Amazon to achieve that?
So I'm sympathetic to the concern, Fiona, but if we take, for instance, to explain the logic, why this is a contest that also sort of takes place within the sort of thinking about the role of these tech giants in the economy and how that feeds into the broader geopolitical picture. So first of all, these companies generate tremendous wealth for the country. And the country needs to have its growth and innovation in order to have then the kind of economy that can also be converted to harder power and broader sort of economic and geopolitical power that can be leveraged. But these same players are also leading in AI development. And there is an argument that you need a certain scale to have the funding to really invest in innovation. So you need to have a lot of data, but you also need to have a lot of computing power to run these models, and you need to be able to afford those AI chips. So all that basically needs to be within the supply chains that American companies can access. And currently, some of these leading tech companies are the ones that have the data, they have the access to the computing power, they have the talent, and they have the ability then to adapt these technologies. And I think it's particularly important right now for the US, because if you think about the sort of the big picture geopolitical contest, even military contest, most of the AI that has military applications today doesn't come from sort of Pentagon-owned investment. It really comes from commercial applications of AI. So anything you do in imaging recognition is also something that is going to help you in military targeting, to identify the targets, to plan your strategies, and then to potentially also develop autonomous weapons. So there is this whole idea that the United States military power is also dependent on its ability to lead in commercial AI technologies, which can then be acquired and repurposed for military settings.
AI technologies requires that we have a monopoly in social media, a monopoly in search, a monopoly in digital advertising, a monopoly in desktop operating systems, and a monopoly in mobile. I mean, why? Can't we organize it better than that? I just don't understand why.
We can organize it better. The argument there is that these business models are lucrative and they fund the R&D in these companies. I am not making that argument.
Well-functioning capital markets. Somebody, some banking people in the audience, help me out here. Can't we fund this some way other than monopoly profits?
Yeah, and I think that is exactly one of the great assets of the US, and one thing where the US is doing much better than Europe, that the capital markets are robust, they are vibrant, they are well-functioning, and they have served the US tech companies extremely well. And I think they continue to serve also in the domain of AI, if you look at the frenzy that there has been in funding AI innovation. So I am completely in agreement that we do not need to and should not accept the argument that we need to sustain these multifaceted monopolies, even when they hurt our societies and our consumers, under the justification that they are somehow needed to prevail in the tech war against China. But that is the argument that is being made, and that argument does resonate. So I think it is one thing that Congress absolutely cares about. It is not comfortable with big tech, but it's certainly not comfortable with China's growing dominance. And it's quite quick to make the connection that these are our targets of regulation, but they are also our tools. And we cannot then crack down on them too much.
Yes. Okay, this is great. I could keep going for a while, but is there a question in the audience? German.
Maybe continuing a bit along the lines that you have started discussing. So I didn't completely understand the mechanisms through which you think that China is expanding its digital empire, right? So the way you defined the digital the approach is essentially state control over the internet, and that doesn't really happen by expanding, by selling infrastructure technology, right? I mean, they're not actually expanding the firewall, the Great Firewall, beyond their borders by doing that. You know, it may have devious implications for other reasons, because maybe, you know, in a war they're going to cut off some infrastructure, or they're going to channel back some data. But I didn't completely understand it. What I do appreciate more is this notion that authoritarian regimes around the world may be very tempted to copy the Chinese model. So in that sense, they're expanding it. But is that realistic? So it seems to me that China is sort of a bit unusual as a country. So I'm a macroeconomist. They're really the only large emerging market country that has effective capital controls. No other emerging market is able to do that because they are using the power of the state in a more forceful way, and they have done this consistently, and they never really liberalized. And so I think the Great Firewall is sort of like in the same vein, right? It's something hard to reproduce. So I don't view it as sort of an expansionary threat, right? I mean, authoritarian systems are definitely expanding, but is this approach to digital regulation expanding? I'm not so sure.
So very good. I think it has a couple of levels. So one is that when China builds the technological infrastructure, that infrastructure is compatible for subsequent Chinese technology. It's often maintained by Chinese vendors, and the technological standards that are underlying that infrastructure are compatible with the standards that are also then easier for further sort of technological acquisitions that then increase the presence of Chinese tech companies in those markets. But by building that technological infrastructure, it often comes with training, when Chinese engineers are also then training how to use that equipment. And so we also see seminars on information management environment. So the Chinese provide the equipment for surveillance and then teach these governments how to deploy these surveillance technologies. So they are basically building the infrastructure for aspiring authoritarians to control their own environments. But there's a second order concern, and this is something that the United States in particular is uncomfortable with, and also many European governments, is that if you allow, for instance, Huawei to build the 5G networks, then also Beijing extends its surveillance empire, because the data that flows through the Chinese infrastructure can find its way back to Beijing, and then gives the Chinese government, an authoritarian government, then an ability to geopolitically leverage that control when they have sort of a hold of the data of the society. So I think that's a second order concern, and that is something, it's really, I use this anecdote in the book, that the US and the EU probably have the luxury to being more worried about surveillance and privacy than many other countries. There are many countries that either welcome control and they don't worry about being surveilled, but also the individuals say that, look, I don't wake up in the morning thinking about my privacy. I worry about being killed. There's a lot of violence, more cameras, more law enforcement, I'm fine with that. And the anecdote that I was referring to is that when the United States was trying to persuade the Malaysian government to abandon Huawei from their market and warn them of surveillance by Beijing, Malaysian Prime Minister said, what is there to spy on in Malaysia? So this is not a deep concern for every country the same way it is for the United States and for the Europeans. So I think it sort of happens in a couple of ways, by basically extending the ability of Beijing to influence these countries. There was evidence, for instance, where the Chinese engineers built the African Union headquarters, and then it turned out that that data was transferred to unknown servers in Shanghai every night from midnight to 2 a.m. And that is one way that you say that the Chinese empire is also extending. But these countries are also looking to Chinese model of governance in how to pass laws, how to try to engage in censorship. But you're absolutely right that China is quite unique. I compare China to Russia. And Russia is now, I would say, an aspiring digital authoritarian. But because it did not build a firewall from the get-go, it is much harder to introduce retroactively. Your people are used to free information. They expect and demand a different information environment. And Russia doesn't have the technological or human capacity to engage in the kind of censorship that Beijing is engaged in. So they're actually much worse at it. They're getting better, and China is partially helping them to get better. But it's very hard to fully replicate the kind of model that China has created on its own market.
In the back in the striped shirt. Sorry, I don't know everyone's name.
Should I introduce myself?
Yes, please.
I'm Razia Akoch, Agence France Presse, AFP news agency. I cover tech and competition. I wanted to, because I picked up on the fact that you said Europeans can legislate, but they have a hard time enforcing. And so I wanted to ask, what does Europe or the EU need to do? Because linked to this, and AI has already been mentioned, they're working on the AI Act. And that's now the big issue that we're all concerned about. But if you're already suggesting that current regulation may not be well enforced, do you have those same concerns for AI? And at the same time, are you also more positive on regulating AI because there is more work on a international, at the G7 level between the EU and the US? There is more discussion between partners.
Yeah. So very good. So I think there are certain ways that we can look at existing digital regulation and identify what have been the failures. So one is that Fiona already brought up the remedies, that you need to, it doesn't really help if you can sort of get a vindication that your theory was right unless you find a way to effectively enforce those rulings. So fines alone don't work. That's a price for doing business, and I think Europeans have learned that the hard way. So 10 billion fine for Google, that was not an issue for them. You really need to strike to the heart of these business models and change the way these companies do business. So I applaud the ambition of the DSA and DMA. They actually are costly commitments. And if those can be well enforced, and it is extremely important for Europeans. This is the moment to show that those European regulations work differently. They work better than the GDPR, they work better than the ex-post enforcement of antitrust, because they allow an intervention that is faster, that is targeted at the very asset of what allows these companies to entrench and maintain and exploit their dominance. So I think in principle, there is a framework that I think is the correct one in principle. But that does require a lot of human resources, very dedicated enforcement, and also then sort of right prioritization. I think these tech companies cannot afford to try to win every battle. They are now getting sort of attacked from so many different directions that they will concede some of them. And I think the Commission also needs to then prioritize what are the cases that they are going to choose to enforce in a ways that show the robustness and sends the right deterrent message of these regulations. I think there's also another thing that I'm happy about with the DMA and DSA, and I come to the AI Act in a moment, is that one of the sort of downsides of the GDPR was that it was not asymmetrical. It was particularly costly for small and medium-sized companies. Again, it was kind of only entrenching the power of the biggest companies that were able to afford to comply with it. So with AI Act, we cannot fully make it asymmetrical, even though there may be an attempt to do so, but even the smaller companies may be producing high-risk AI. So this risk-based approach doesn't fully sort of distinguish across your ability to comply, your resources to comply. So I think that's one challenge there. Whether I'm optimistic, because there's certainly an international conversation of dangers of AI and the need to regulate AI, also the kind of the economic opportunities associated with AI are recognized to be tremendously important around the world. So I think the regulators, there is a need to enforce, but there's also a palpable sense that we cannot curtail innovation. This is our moment to sort of use this technology to democratize opportunities in many parts of the world. So I don't believe really that these international conversations lead into kind of cohesive, robust regulatory framework, but it certainly makes it a bigger part of national conversations that elevate the relative salience of AI. And I don't know whether Fiona thinks that the tone of the conversation is different in the US around AI, even because the tech companies themselves have been quite vocal in recognizing that we don't do this alone. Like, we actually need some guardrails. But it's obviously less costly, clear for Sam Altman to go to US Congress and say, please regulate me, because he knows that nothing is coming his way. Whereas if he makes that ask in the European Parliament, the answer is, you bet, we're on it. So I think he knows that very well. But I don't have an exact answer what the EU's ability to enforce AI Act will be, because in many ways there's also concern that it's a fast-moving technology. It's a technology that can be applied in so many different ways, and there's this general concern that lawmakers don't understand the technology well enough to regulate it effectively. And there I push back on that argument. Fiona was mentioning the seatbelts. We regulate a lot of industries where our lawmakers are not necessarily experts. They don't build airplanes, yet we're all pretty comfortable that airline safety is regulated. Our lawmakers don't know how to develop vaccines, yet we all are comfortable with pharmaceutical regulation. So I think this is a hard area to regulate, it's a hard area to enforce, but it's particularly important then for the Europeans not to wait until we have built a perfect enforcement vision and machinery. So it may be one of those areas where I'm prepared to say that perfect is not the enemy of the good, and we cannot afford to wait for 5 years to continue to learn and figure out how on earth can we enforce this.
Supplement that with a quick remark. I do think that AI has changed the tone about regulation in the United States just in the last few months, because both Democrats and Republicans have a shared concern about national security, about imitation of people's whole personas, doing things that they otherwise wouldn't do, labor issues, every kind of self-destruction and military problem. And elections, exactly. So I think all of that put together has generated a coalition of the worried, and that might possibly do something, although as you all know from reading the newspaper, we don't really have a functioning government at the moment. More questions, Heather?
Thanks, Heather Graby at Bruegel. So you could argue that the kind of division of labour is beneficial, because a regulator that's in a different jurisdiction from the primary regulated is going to be less open to regulatory capture. But is that really the case? We're all very aware of the presence and often at debates like this, the sponsorship of tech giants here in Brussels. So curious to know your views on whether regulatory capture is evident in the EU. And the second question is about how to make regulation more dynamic. The EU is a regulatory superpower, but it's very slow moving, and this is an extremely dynamic environment. So given that legislation, the legislative cycle in the EU is always slow and subject to lowest common denominator outcomes, and even if lawmakers are becoming ever more expert, as you were rightly pointing out, are there ways in which the EU could change its regulatory model to be able to keep up with AI faster in the future?
I don't think immune to regulatory capture. There's a lot of lobbying, and if you take the Brussels effect seriously, when you capture the EU, you capture the world, so the gains are very obvious. But there's also research that shows that lobbying in the EU leads to more balanced outcomes, that even civil society has access to lawmakers, and it balances off to some extent, especially compared to Europe, the power of the tech companies. So if you look at the lobbying that went into the GDPR, the DMA, the DSA, ultimately it accomplished only so much. So these are still relatively strong regulations that came out of the regulatory process where the tech companies really tried to influence the outcome and ultimately got relatively little, I would say. So I do think that all the more that we see the tech companies influence the conversations directly or indirectly, which is also an important challenge, we need to ensure that these other stakeholders have access to policymaking, directly and indirectly. And I think that's the only way that we can feel that the system is working and the system is legitimate. So the question of sort of more nimble, agile way of legislating, and I think that's very hard because it's absolutely a goal that we all would agree that would need to be part of it. Speed is not the only goal. So for instance, China is fast. Democracy slows things down. And the way Europe is structured, we have 27 member states. We have 3 key institutions. It is prone to be very slow. At the same time, I think, for instance, the DMA went through the process very fast. It was actually a relatively fast, given the ambition of the regulation. So I think ultimately, if we are trying to aim for the balance between speed and quality and deliberation and having the kind of multi-stakeholder conversation, we can't really move much faster. Ultimately, I think it results in worse regulation. But I think that the way the laws are drafted, we need to be more comfortable with the kind of trade-off that the laws are sometimes less precise, and they leave actually more open-ended discretion for enforcers, even if ultimately that moves it away from the legislators, but it allows for the law to sort of adjust to the changing situation, be a little bit more agile and be a little bit more nimble. But I think there is a trade-off. So ultimately you can't go into having just legislation on principles and delegate it all to enforcement, even though that would allow you then to be probably more flexible in the enforcement. But I think it's one of those that you need to be aware of the trade-off and try to optimize, given that you probably can't have it all at the same time.
Let me just object to the premise for a minute. If you think about the last years in Europe, there's been GDPR, the Platform to Business Act, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act. I mean, I'm not seeing much slowness there at all. I think like the pace of legislation seems quite quick. I'll also say that inside the DMA, which is the one I know the best, there is, first of all, goals that are fairly general, and the DSA to some extent also, safety. Okay, what constitutes a threat to safety may change over time, but if your goal is safety, then the regulator can say to the platform, what are you doing about this latest harm that has come up because of some new technology? So I think goals like contestability and fairness are helpful because they're not technological specifications, they're end goals. And then secondly, inside the DMA, there is a process to update it, so it's self-updating in a sense. You can do a market investigation to add a new platform, to add a new core platform service, to make a new rule. And that is easier than passing a whole new piece of legislation. So it is, in some sense, designed to be dynamic within the law itself, which I think is a really nice feature. Okay, more people. This gentleman here who's just behind.
Thanks very much. David Ringrose. I'm dealing with digital issues in the External Action Service. I had a question. It's not another empire, but it's certainly a big battleground, which is the multilateral sphere. And you touched on it briefly with AI. But I was just wondering how you see all of this work on digital, not necessarily regulation, but principles and so on in the multilateral sphere. We have a lot of different, we have things like the DFI, for example. We have a lot of work, obviously, on standards and things in ITU. Now we have Amandeep Gill being very active in New York to try to build a global digital compact and AI principles and all this type of thing. But when we look at this, of course, one of the problems is that this is often kind of the G7 talking to themselves in China. And without the involvement of most of the rest of the world. So under that circumstance, how do you see this whole multilateral process fitting in or complementing all of the three empires that you talked about?
So very good. So I, sort of in principle or by my own convictions, would like to be a strong supporter of multilateralism. I think, for instance, AI doesn't know borders. We would all be better off if there was some supranational governance. At the same time, I think I would be naive if I was too optimistic on sort of painting a picture whereby it is feasible to have as international of a governance framework as would be ideal. Because ultimately, even if you look at the list of prohibited AI applications in the EU's AI Act. That's precisely the way, sort of drawn from how China is deploying AI. So it's very hard to see how China and the EU would really come together and say we have a shared vision and let's work towards common understanding of AI. We would need to do something very kind of lowest common denominator. We all agree on transparency, or we all agree on our version of accountability. And so I think what we see probably more is that if we, and there is a trade-off, if you leave China out, a big part of AI governance and sort of AI development is not part of the framework. But we see more of a sort of conversations that can be deeper among like-minded allies. And that sort of leads a little bit to the division of the world, to the coalition of techno-democracies and techno-autocracies, which I think is understandable, but it's questionable how helpful it is. Because ultimately there's not always a clear line between what constitutes democracy, and if the US and the EU have too hard of a definition, what do you do with India? Some of India's actions in the last couple of years certainly don't merit sort of counting them as really committed to rule of law and protection of rights and the democracy and the process the way that we like to label it. And are we then just pushing many of the countries to the Chinese empire by basically saying this is our definition of what it means to be a democracy? So I think there is a trade-off. What we can probably see more, and conversations still take place in standard-setting organizations. I think those are important battlegrounds, and those are battlegrounds that China has been deploying quite effectively. Sort of chairing many working groups and proposing a great number of standards that now come from Chinese companies. And the US and the EU have kind of woken up to realize that their previous dominance in those standard-setting organizations is withering to some extent. And I think that's why we see kind of a reinforcement of a transatlantic dialogue, for instance, the Trade and Technology Council, which I see as a sort of a potentially productive institutional framework to continue the dialogue. But that is a far cry from a truly sort of international attempts to, in meaningful way, to have conversations in multilateral setting. That said, I still think it's better that we even have dialogues that are more inclusive, so that even if we don't agree to any ambitious global AI treaty, we have a better understanding what those differences are, what is driving those differences, and how we can still somehow manage the uneasy coexistence. Because I don't think we are seeing full decoupling of digital economies. The economies are just too intertwined, so somehow we need to find a way to manage some of that friction, and I think more conversation there is better than less.
I'm going to take a few questions now. People who've had their hands up will do just a few in a row and then let you kind of globally respond. So I don't know where the mic went, but here. Okay, so maybe just pass it to the front there, please. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to make a comment and also a question. Gao from the Chinese mission to the EU. I'm not sure if I'm the only Chinese in this room, but I think there are obviously some viewpoints I share, but there are things that I don't share. I have to first put the record right. You talk about the so-called incident at the AU headquarters. That was reported by American media, and it was refuted several times by the EU secretary officials, and also later by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. But unfortunately, those kind of refutation was not reported by the Western mainstream media, because they always report what they wanted to. So I have to say that is a disinformation, if not misinformation. So I have to set that record right. And also that actually brings me to a fundamental issue. This approach you propose, and also a lot of people share, I think, is this, dividing this world into two groups. The good with the evil, the democracy with the autocracy, and that is not right. And actually that is the fundamental issue, the root causes for many of the problems we have today in this world. Because there are other choices. You forget the agencies of many other countries in the world. There are so many other. There are America, there's Europe, China, but there are others. How can we not have a Brazilian model, an Indian model, or a South African model? So it doesn't have to be two blocks, And also you talk that if we lose this competition, then we will, that's the end of the day. That's not. It's like the democracy will be in tatters. That's not the answer. To many of us in the developing world, that is, the hidden word is the supremacy of US. You use this as a pretext to make sure that you control everything. That's the feeling shared by many in the developing world, the global south. And also I have to say, the so-called battle or war, or digital war, we are not interested. China is not interested in that. The US starting from your president, last, and also continuing in this president. We're not interested in that at all. I mean, it doesn't serve anybody's interest. Look at the problem we have globally. And also for China, let me say a few words about how we look at this issue, regulation. Yeah,
Keep it reasonably short, because there are some other people who want to
I think there are balances.
Talk.
The first is about balance of technology and regulation. That's something we have to achieve. You said the pros and cons of the so-called European model and also the American model. We share that. Actually, China has been studying the different pros and cons of these models for a long time. We are learning a lot, especially from the European exercise, and there were quite a few delegations visiting. And also there's the balance between the national interest and international cooperation. Actually, that brings me to the question. Somebody just mentioned, I think this is a fundamental question. That is whether middle ground can be achieved. I think it can, it should be. Otherwise, as the Secretary General of the UN said, there will be two different groups, two markets, two forces, two regulations. It will bring problems. Like if you look at the development of this mobile phone, like 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. 5G, first time in the world, we have a unified system. Now, when we look at 6G, it's going to be two or even more systems. That would be nightmare for many of us, not only here, this world. So we hope on this regulation thing, we can achieve. I think we could put UN in the driver's seat. Let's hope that we can make some difference tomorrow, next year in the UN when we have that future summit. I think that's something both China, US, and Europe have to join hands in this exercise. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Just anybody? Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Aitana. I'm attorney at the European Economic and Social Committee. Thanks for your talk. I'm particularly interested in technology-facilitated violence towards women and other minorities. So, as you said, the European model is considered a right-based model, but the lack of enforcement leaves a lot of responsibility to the individual to protect themselves of the emerging threats that come with new technologies. So I was wondering, considering also that the tech industry is still very much male-dominated, how you think the EU should account for this gender perspective or intersectional perspective when regulating technologies and the social risks. Thank you.
Great. And then Christophe, and one more.
Yeah, is it working? Yeah, thank you. So I would take an helicopter view very fast. So there is a narrative in Europe that basically China has a lot of data and a lot of computing powers, and the US is able to monetize data and to collect a lot of data, and there is no human right, like in Europe, for consent, for example. And so some people in Europe think, well, we should replicate the model of China and the US, because otherwise we'll like behind. So what is your take about that, first one? And the second one, there is some rumors, apparently, that China, through social media or e-commerce platforms, basically want to make some European citizens stupid because they entertain people. And in China, at the same time, they make barriers so that Chinese people don't use social media too much. So what do you think about this take? It's probably rumors, but it may have an impact in the future if it's true. Thank you.
Right, and the last one. Can we do one more, if you are quick?
It's a complicated one, but Eric van der Merwe from eCyber. I'm just wondering, so have you thought about the economic consequences of third countries adopting one model? And then specifically regarding sort of digital flows, technologies, or even digital trade. So how would that look like for these countries that adopt one of the three models? And I'm asking this because what we do see in our own research regarding so the adoption of data regulations, which I presume is one of key factor of a digital empire, is that, I mean, each model comes at a certain cost. And I'm not talking about sort of compliance costs, but really sort of dynamic trade cost over time. As much as the Chinese model comes at a certain cost for these countries, as much as certain aspects for the US model comes at certain cost, equally benefits also for the European Union model in certain aspects. So if you put that sort of in a wider perspective, what are your thoughts, or what have you encountered in your research on this?
In
Yes.
a few minutes.
So let me first, I defend the research when it comes to African Union. It was first documented by Le Monde, French and not Americans. And there's one reason why African Union was adamant in not fully blaming the Chinese for that, because they depend on China on their funding. And China is funding a lot of African Union, including had funded the headquarters, the building of temple, also a lot of peacekeeping forces in the region. So it's a very complicated issue for that reason. So where I do agree with you fully is that the ongoing trade and tech war is costly for all parties. It is very costly for China. It is very costly for the United States. It's costly for Europe. It's costly for citizens and consumers. I think all of us would benefit from de-escalation, because that is not in the economic or political interest of the stability in the world. So I think that we do need to recognize, and we do see elements of restraint and de-escalation because of those reasons. That's why we haven't seen full stock market decoupling. Chinese government wants to let the Chinese companies still tap into the global capital markets. The US does not fully ban exports to China. We see export licensing. And I certainly hope that we don't see full human decoupling. I want to continue to be able to teach Chinese students at Columbia. It makes my work much more interesting. The book is much richer because I had Chinese students work with me on that book, even though some of them ask especially that they will not be thanked in the book. But I do say that the kind of human decoupling that we are witnessing, that's the one that I think prevents us from having the kind of dialogue that keeps me hopeful that there will be a better place going forward. On a few other the questions on the diversity point, I think that is something that is a very right concern. If you look at, for instance, who is developing these technologies in Silicon Valley, there's a huge white male, Asian male bias, and that is now documented in the products in many ways. And I think what the Europeans can do, we cannot tell who is going to be building those technologies. But by revealing the kind of biases that come through algorithms, we can at least be cognizant of that and have a conversation about any biases that are part of our digital governance because of those inputs that are not necessarily non-discriminatory or diverse in an ideal way. This idea of Chinese having a master plan of kind of shielding their own societies from the harmful effects of social media and restricting, for instance, this kind of mind-numbing gambling or gaming is something that I've adopted in our family sometimes. I said, we have the rule of the Chinese Communist Party and there's a limit to how many hours you can play. So I don't think it's necessarily always bad, regulatory paternalism, but at the same time, it's probably an ill-suited way to regulate in places like the United States. It would be, I haven't heard that there would be of adopting different models, that there are costs to doing so. And I think it's absolutely right, which is why we probably don't see as much of direct emulation of a European model, because you need to be conscious of what are your institutions, what are the other legislations in place, and what would be the kind of tailored version, inspired maybe by the European experience and principles, but done in the way that minimizes those costs that would come from a misfit in regulatory models. So ultimately, I think it's also costly to develop regulations from the scratch. So very few regulators actually do that. So the fact that the Europeans have experimented with regulation, it is a very valuable experience. Hopefully, the other countries can replicate what the Europeans do well, but also avoid some of the mistakes that are inevitable when you are a trailblazer and you start regulating the space without necessarily the same kind of experience. Did I now get to most of the questions? Excellent. They were very rich, so full justice to them, but thank you so much.
Well, we are over time, so let me bring this to a close. I think your last remark, Anu, on how we expect other jurisdictions to look at what's happening in Europe and emulate the good and avoid the mistakes tells us that there are more books to come and more issues to discuss in the future. So I look forward to seeing everybody back at Bruegel in a couple of years to do that. Meanwhile, let's give a round of applause to our visitor.
Thank you.